Hello, everybody. We're just running a couple minutes late. Sorry about that. We are going to start the stream any second.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for being here today and joining this event. We're really excited to be bringing a panel around the film of Dark Waters and the incredible issues that it has brought up to change the face of chemicals strategy in Europe and the world. It is so great to be here with such an incredible panel, and I will introduce each and every one of them once we have watched the trailer. So could we please cue the trailer? Thank you very much.
I am a corporate attorney. I defend chemical companies.
Well, now you can defend me.
This farm is like a graveyard. There's something wrong.
That's chemicals, I'm telling you.
That chemical, what if you drank it?
Drank it? You don't.
You need to tell me what in the hell's going on.
DuPont is knowingly poisoning 70,000 local residents for the last 40 years.
You want to turn against an iconic American company?
Yes. You want to flush your career down the toilet? Be my guest.
He was willing to risk his family for a stranger who needed his help.
They have all the firepower. I know. I was one of them. Our government is captive to DuPont. They crossed the line. The system is rigged. They want us to think it'll protect us. We protect us. We do.
Exactly. We protect us. And that's why we're here today, to talk about how far we can go with some of the incredible steps that have already been taken at a policy level globally. So I'd like to introduce our panelists. We're still waiting for one person to join, but I'll go ahead and introduce Dr. Maria Neira. Dr. Maria Neira is the director of the World Health Organization, Department of Environment, Climate Change and Health. She works to raise awareness of the health challenges posed by climate change and air pollution and improve health and safety around the globe, especially within the most vulnerable populations. I've also got the pleasure to introduce you to Anne-Sophie Bakker, who's the Executive Director of the International Chemical Secretariat, an independent non-profit organization that advocates for substitution of toxic chemicals to safer alternatives. ChemSec advocates for progressive legislation, sustainable corporate chemicals management, and offers guidance to companies committed to changing the way they work with chemicals. In partnership with Dark Waters, they pioneered the No to PFAS corporate movement. And we have with us Dr. Arlene Bloom, the biophysical chemist, author and mountaineer, executive director of the Green Science Policy Institute, and a research associate in chemistry at the UC Berkeley. Arlene's extensive research and policy work has contributed to preventing the use of flame retardants and other harmful chemicals in children's sleepwear, furniture, electronics, and other products worldwide. Her current mountain is to educate decision makers and the public to reduce the use of the entire class of harmful chemicals in everyday products. We also have with us Laura Facciolo, I hope that I've pronounced your name correctly, activist and scientific advisor of the Mama No PFAS group. She's represented residents living in the Veneto region of the northern Italy who have experienced extremely elevated PFAS blood levels due to local contamination, and has participated in huge demonstrations of resistance led by women and mothers. I'm just going to see if Rob has managed to arrive. Let's have a look. It doesn't look like he has landed yet, but to introduce you to Robert Belot, who will be joining us shortly. He is the man, the true story behind Dark Waters, the real life hero who gave up his whole life to take this issue into the global arena. He's an environmental attorney from Cincinnati, Ohio, known for bringing successful lawsuits against DuPont on behalf of people in West Virginia and Ohio who had been exposed to toxic PFOA chemicals. Rob has spent more than 20 years litigating hazardous dumping of PFAS chemicals, and his story is told in Dark Waters and more detail in his book, Exposure, which he can tell you more about later today. So what an honor it is to have so many powerful policy women on a panel. I think that is a rare thing. So I first start by saying that, and we'll jump into our first theme discussion today. You know, we want to talk about the landscape. We know we've done really well. You know, the EU has released its chemical strategy. It's made its commitment to banning non-essential PFAS chemicals. But how does the landscape look in terms of PFAS awareness and regulation approaches for 2020 and beyond, when we go beyond Europe? And here, what we're wanting to look at right now in the framework of your work, and I'll start with Laura, what is the impact of this PFAS legislation movement on the communities that you deal with every day at a grassroots level? What impact are you seeing, and do you think this will have in the near future?
So thanks, first of all, for this huge opportunity to speak about this problem. We are not seeing at the moment changes because actually, as you well said, we are in a situation here in particular that is causing us issues because we have the highest pollution probably in the world due to these chemicals, and we are having the highest level in our blood. So we will see changes actually when this chemical will be, all these chemicals will be treated as a class. We have seen that the EU directive was released, and it's let's say it's a step. So we have something done, but it's not enough. And at the moment, we will not see impact on our lives, and we need to do more and more, and to have this, if possible, a complete ban of these compounds when non-useful.
You know, Laura, you mentioned something very powerful there, which is it is a step, but we're looking at this chemical as a whole class, and you know, leading very powerfully into my question for Dr. Neira about the health impacts of your community. I mean, Dr. Neira, we're aware of the health impacts of PFAS, but chemical producers say that large PFAS polymers are not harmful. How does the World Health Organization sit on this, and what are the perspectives on the harm and the intersection between that harm when we're dealing with health and environment?
Thank you. And as you say, it's such a pleasure to see women around. I don't know whether we are powerful or not, but probably we are doing our best to have an influence on the work we are doing. And this is the case for the chemical safety group in WHO, you know, under the environmental health. We are trying to look at and provide all the scientific arguments that will help to move this agenda. One of the problems we have on the chemicals is that we see only the tip of the iceberg. I mean, we did an assessment recently looking at those chemicals that they were the top 10 chemicals in terms of harming human health. And only with that estimation, we conclude that they were represented an estimation of 1.7 million deaths every year. But is that the total picture? Not at all. I mean, we are very conscious that we know only about the impact of few of them, and the agenda is huge. Now, in terms of these ones specifically, my colleagues working on water and sanitation, so they are the ones that we have a revision, and every year the revision of the water quality guidelines. And we are Jennifer de France, yet another woman, very, very knowledgeable and very competent on this topic. She's looking specifically at that. In addition, the WHO regional office in Euro, as you know, they did a very interesting report on the case of Benetton when that's happened. And it was called Keeping Our Water Clean, the case of water contamination in the Benetton region in Italy. And I think we put it there some important lessons about the precautionary principle, the importance of the interdisciplinary work, once again, the importance of mitigation measures that should be very quick. And now, when you have the presence of these compounds and they are so persistent and so largely used, is the combination and the accumulation that will represent a problem most of the time. So this is our daily battle on tracking and making sure that chemicals are still useful in our daily life, which are for many purposes, but making sure that they will not have a negative impact or harming our health. And I'm happy to join this battle with all of you on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Neera. I think, like you said, it's about the mitigation measures. It's about knowing how persistent these chemicals are. And it's also the tracking and making sure that that they're not going to have a negative impact on us as citizens. And I think, a huge component there is obviously the corporate engagement. And it brings me great pleasure to bring in Anne-Sophie, who, with ChemSec, they kind of pioneered the No to PFAS corporate movement. And since, we did that fabulous launch event in the European Parliament last February, there's been a take-up of 30 companies. And I'd love you to go into that a bit more, Anne-Sophie. What's the role of corporations in this discussion, and how do they sit in this regulatory movement that's been happening in the last 12 months?
Yeah, it's actually 34 companies already now, and among them companies as H&M and Kingfish, New Balance. And I think what drives the company are two things. First, brands, they don't want PFAS in their products. They don't want to sell hazardous chemicals to us, normal human beings. They don't want to do that. And in addition then, man-made hazardous chemicals are a commercial risk for companies. And in US, in addition, liability claims could happen. So, these two reasons, I think, is the interest behind companies really want to act on it. And for many companies, they don't know what they have in their products. And even if they find out that they have PFAS, some of them don't really know how can I substitute that? What could I use instead? And they are too small to impact the suppliers if they know the suppliers. So that's the problem. And by joining this PFAS movement, then they call on policymakers to regulate PFAS efficiently. It's a call on the chemical industry to start innovate safer alternatives. And there's a recognition that PFAS is a major health and environmental problem. And it's also a commitment to end all non-essential PFAS uses in their products and supply chains. So I think they're really interested in doing it. They see it coming and they realize they don't want that in their products.
It's encouraging for us to know, and I think if there are citizens watching today, that corporates are taking action to be the ones leading this change, given that we are at the end of the supply chain as citizens. So it's always encouraging when all the lines in the ecosystem of power and influence come together to make a change happen. So I think what's interesting that you talk about there, Anne-Sophie, is the substitutes, the alternatives, the safer options and the frameworks for corporations to be able to sign up to this pledge and it not to affect their ecosystem as well and make that difference. And I think there, how does the regulation and policy facilitate this transition for companies will be a crucial one. And on that question of policy and how has it evolved in terms of, a group class versus individual class regulation, I'd like to bring in Dr. Bloom to talk about what do you think attitudes, how are they placed right now when it comes to group class regulation and classification, or are we still fighting a battle of this should be done one by one? Your microphone's muted, Arlene.
Next. Anyway, I have to say that I was delighted to hear Laura and Maria and Anne-Sophie and you talk about the whole class of PFAS, because that is something we're scientists And at our institute back in 2013, we brought together people from business, government, NGOs, academia to figure out what to do about the harmful chemicals in everyday products, because there's 80,000 chemicals out there. It takes years to discover the chemicals harmful, to do the advocacy. And when you phase out a chemical, the replacement is invariably something with similar structure, function, and harm. And that is the most true with PFAS, because there are so many of them, tens of thousands. And so I will just put in a plug that if somebody wants to know more about the class concept, if they go to 6classes.org, we came up with 6 classes, and we have 4-minute videos to learn where the classes are used, why they're harmful, and how to reduce exposure. And after learning about the classes, I have to continue on what Anne-Sophie was saying, is that companies, for example, Keen Shoes here in the US, decided to phase out the whole class of PFAS. And they looked and they found there were 101 places in their shoes that they had PFAS, and that 70 of them were not necessary, non-essential. And those 70 could be phased out immediately. And they did that right away. And then they had 31 others, and that took years of hard work to find alternatives. So we believe that just stopping the unessential uses immediately is a really fast route. And when we started talking about the class concept, we actually thought it would be easy for business to do the class concept. They can do it overnight, and say, we want these chemicals out, while government has many, many hoops, not to say the chemical industry's opposition to taking any action. But really good news from the US is, in spite of the difficult political world that we've been in for the last 4 years, there has been significant changes around PFAS, mostly through the military budget. So our military, which before was required to use PFAS firefighting foams, a source of major contamination to communities, they couldn't use a foam that was non-PFAS. Now they're going to be required to use non-PFAS foams and to start doing non-PFAS purchasing. So that's good news, that even in the past, that because contaminated communities like Laura's have a big voice, and there are people from both sides of the aisle in America who have contaminated communities, and they listen to some extent. And anyway, the good news I'll just end with is Biden has publicly said that he wants to really list PFAS as hazardous substances, support research, do a lot of things that should make a difference. So I really feel optimistic. Starting with Rob's lonely years of hard work, that we've seen such an extraordinary change in the last year or two. So
it's unbelievable, Dr. Bloom, that you the context of how long this fight has been going on, and it does give me a really kind of nice way to bring Rob in. We've done a slight introduction to you already, so I won't repeat that, Rob. But I will say, thank you for sharing the Guardian published article today as well. You have reminded people in the UK and the world that this chemical is sitting in our blood, in all of our bodies, everywhere, and this is something that should be dealt with as severely as our kind of Paris Agreement on climate change, as we're going to discuss the basis of that. But I'd love you, Rob, to say, how has the film really brought your work that has gone on for so many years at a corporate, at a governance, at a policy, at a human level? Please share with us your perspectives.
Sure. Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. And I apologize for the technical issue there at the beginning. But, it's been incredible to watch, particularly as the film Dark Waters has rolled out, the growing awareness of what this is, which is a massive worldwide public health threat. This is something that's been going on for decades, pretty much unnoticed by all of us who've been exposed against our will and without our knowledge, that these chemicals have been out there, getting into our air, getting into our water, getting into our soil, getting into us, in virtually every living creature on the planet, because information was withheld for so many years. And now that the public is finally starting to become aware that this has happened, The scientific community has been doing amazing work, in helping to educate folks about what the true scope of the threat is. Regulators, legislators are now starting to take this issue on, as Dr. Bloom was mentioning. We are seeing things I thought I would never see. For 20 years, we have been working to try to get this information out to the public about this health threat. And it's been remarkable. And I am also, I guess, cautiously optimistic that things are changing and changing in a big way. And it's been incredible to see as the story comes out and people start to realize this is something that impacts all of us. It's not just one farm in West Virginia. It's not just one small town along the Ohio River. This is everywhere. It's all over the globe. It's in almost every country that's been looking for it. And you hear it referred to as this emerging contaminant, yet what is emerging is our awareness, finally, that it's out there. And it's been there for quite some time. People have likely been exposed to it for quite some time. So I'm incredibly encouraged to see, particularly here in the United States, we have states that are now taking this issue on and saying we need to act quickly, to address this, to protect folks. We see discussions occurring now for the first time on the federal level, to actually legislate and regulate and stop these chemicals from continuing to be emitted and to stop more of these. I don't know to what extent we've touched on yet this idea that, look, it took 20 years to bring the story out about one of these PFAS chemicals, PFOA. And while we finally got that information out and we finally start to take action to address that one and the related one, PFOS, used in firefighting foams and Scotchgard, they're tweaked a bit. And suddenly they're new. And this process starts all over again. So it has been incredibly encouraging. When I was able to be in Europe and visit with folks in the EU and in the UK who adopt this much more of a comprehensive approach to these chemicals. So we don't address them one at a time and take 20 years while communities and people continue to be exposed, develop cancers and other diseases, to act more proactively on a much more precautionary basis to say, we know that these things could cause this kind of a harm. Let's address all of those in the same class that have these same characteristics. Persistence, which is incredible, unprecedented. Let's address these in a much more comprehensive way and take not 20 years, each one at a time, but let's deal with this now. We all know this is an ongoing threat to all of us. We have these chemicals coursing through our veins. At the time, we're all dealing with a massive pandemic as well. Chemicals that can affect our immunity and that have been linked with vaccine issues. So this is the time to act, and having discussions like this is so incredibly important. And I thank everybody who's listening as well, who is going to have this discussion and continue to insist that we do something about it now. So thanks to all of you for joining today. Thank you, and thanks for having me.
Thanks, Rob. I mean, whenever I hear you speak, the statement more persistent than PFAS comes to mind. You are more persistent than PFAS. And what you bring up here is the point of how do we go from, we really need to go from, instead of reacting, precaution, caution, and doing the research we need to prevent rather than just solve these issues as and when they happen and solve the effects of this awful chemical on citizens. And I think it really links in well to how do communities louder continue the fight now? How does your community continue the fight with this progress, with this movement? What now? What do you continue to do and how can you continue to do it to make sure that this goes further?
So the first thing is to try to involve as much people as possible, because we need new resources, and because even if we think that this problem is well known all over the world, unfortunately we are still facing a lot of people that do not know anything about it, do not know about the harm that are causing these chemicals to our health, and it's difficult to try to have them involved in this process of change. What is better is for sure, other than having these new resources and convince people that we need to change first of all, us to change the behavior, for example, in what we are doing when we are buying things, to try to do the right choice every time, because this is causing the companies to change the production of their products. So we are more powerful than we think. And also when we have to deal with the governances, when we can speak with the people that are in the bottom's room, and we need to make it very clear. Then we are speaking about our health, our future, and we need to deal with this and to try to find out a solution that is agreed from the grassroots, I'd say.
Thank you so much, Laura. From the people in the grassroots to the people in the button room, Dr. Neira, I go back to you. I'm bringing you back into the discussion. How do we go from communities that are looking at how this chemical is, we've raised quite a big awareness, the US, Europe, Italy, but Dr. Neira, how do we take it to the next level? What about countries like Vietnam? What about the world? What about beyond this kind of stream of awareness that is very powerful that we've created, but how do we make sure that this transcends to company supply chains that might be in countries that have not been mentioned yet in our discussion today?
Yeah, as Rob says, thank you for organizing this discussion, and it's getting an emerging knowledge now about that, although it's still a lot to do. Just to give you a flavor of what the international community is about for the health component, let me just share with you something that happened yesterday, which is historic for me, and maybe we can make some parallel here in comparison. Yesterday, published at The Guardian and in many other newspapers, but The Guardian was publishing yesterday, an historic sentence about the recognition of air pollution as the death cause for a little girl, 9 years old, who passed away 7 years ago from asthma, very serious asthma attacks. I'm saying this because for us in the same environmental health group, this was something historic. We have been providing the evidence about what exposure to air pollution represents for our health. We have the evidence that it causes 7 million premature deaths every year. It is still, the lack of action is something that paralyzes you. So how can it be possible that we are proving that it represents 7 million deaths and still action is not taken at the level of ambition that will be equivalent to the level of the risk? I'm saying this because when you look at the chemicals, the agenda is even much more complicated. Because first we are confronted with this request for evidence one by one, and I think Arlena was perfect, and Dr. Bloom was perfect on saying we need to group, we need to have classes, otherwise we will be always late, and we will be always totally reactive, and still our forces will be always very small. I think Laura mentioned it, that we need to in WHO, we were able to bring the issue of SICAM, for instance, the strategic management of the wise management of chemicals, several times already to the World Health Assembly, which means that the ministers of health, and 194 ministers of health, for the last 3-4 years, they have been having any time, every year in the agenda of the issues to discuss the issue of chemical safety and harmful chemicals, which is quite exceptional because normally you discuss it about diseases and it's more difficult to incorporate, other issues. And for us, it was very important to bring chemicals to the World Health Assembly and for the ministers to hear that and to endorse those resolutions and take some concrete actions that they want to now pursue. And particularly, I don't know whether you are aware of a roadmap that we did last year on the implementation of chemical safety. And this can help us in this specific PFAS issue, although, as I say, But if we, as the health community, we mobilize a little bit more, raising awareness, then the citizens are the ones that will be putting pressure on their own governors and policy makers and the legislation to move. But the agenda is not an easy one. And particularly the ministers of health, they feel very disempowered, even if the evidence is there to take action. You said, I think it was Rob saying that it takes 20 years to go one by one. It took us 50 years on the tobacco since the day we have scientific evidence until the day we managed to have a framework convention on tobacco. And still, we are not forbidding tobacco. We are not banning tobacco. We are just to say we have to regulate a little bit. So I'm not pessimistic. I am very optimistic, but I think our optimism has to come from science, from grouping, and from the advocacy that we can do with the users and the consumers, and then giving them some non-regrets recommendations. So something that nobody can challenge. You don't have enough science to prove this recommendation, but there is nothing wrong in saying all the pregnant women, for instance, refrain on and reduce the list of chemicals you use in your daily life or things like that. Over.
Thank you, Dr. Neera. I think, crucially, you say the science, the grouping, the advocacy, and then, of course, the recommendations. And I think I'm going to go back to Anne-Sophie now. Within those groups, Anne-Sophie, the science, the grouping, the advocacy, and then recommendations, I think through the No to PFAS movement that you've been working on, what can business contribute to this, to these three actions to empower the awareness and to move forward on powerful voluntary involvement, which may lead to global commitments, let's say?
I mean, first, all companies, downstream companies, have to find out what do they have in the products. They have to do an inventory. Do they have PFAS? Do they not have PFAS? As we said before, Arlene said, quite many cases we have learned that they are unnecessary. They're not needed there. But there are some uses maybe, but for the main part, it's not needed. And so many companies have talked to us and they weren't aware of that they were having that. In the shoes, yeah, in the cosmetics, did you know? Lately, one of my colleagues went to hair cutter and came back and told me, do you know the shampoo? It contained PFAS. This is reality. And the hair cutter, of course, had not a clue about that, really. Yeah. So first of all, they need to do inventory and of course sign up to this PFAS moment, because the aim is really to show for decision makers that there are lots of companies that don't want to use PFAS. And quite many of them need support to find alternatives and where to go and what to use instead. But to show for decision makers, there are lots of companies that are driving our economy and they really want to get out of these chemicals. And in the same way, also to highlight for decision makers that there are alternatives, the alternative providers. There are companies producing other chemicals that can be used. And sometimes they need to protect the market for them to enable the first steps to go into the market and find a niche there. But this is really needed now to highlight that it is possible. The economy in the world will not explode because of this. It will continue. And we can substitute it. We can find safe alternatives, or in many cases, we don't need them at all. So that is so important now to highlight on different levels, globally and regional.
Thank you so much, Anne-Sophie. I think it's a really good point now. We've got some audience questions, but I'd like to show an impact video about all the results that Dark Waters has achieved in terms of the historic archive of all the work of the people sat on this panel today. Dark Waters has also got a video that has showcased what has been achieved in the last 12 months. So we'll just show that video for us and for the audience, and then we'll come back with some audience questions. Cue the video, Greg.
Since its premiere, the film Dark Waters has touched the lives of millions with one simple truth.
This level of political corruption has essentially poisoned people's blood.
For decades, companies have polluted our water with dangerous chemicals known as PFAS, or forever chemicals. The film Dark Waters tells the story of Rob Bilott, played by Mark Ruffalo, a corporate defense attorney turned environmental hero, after committing his life to defending the public from forever chemicals.
DuPont is knowingly poisoning 70,000 local residents for the last 40 years.
With the film in hand, we created the Fight Forever Chemicals campaign to sound the alarm on a public health crisis that has been unspoken and invisible.
basically what they call forever chemicals. They're long chain fluorocarbons designed to withstand any kind of breakdown.
Together with our partners around the world, we asked audiences to join us in the fight.
New communities are waking up almost every day.
In the US, we encouraged consumers to stop buying products made with forever chemicals and gave them a way to reach out to their own representatives to create change. We traveled to DC, where Mark, Rob, and a host of other advocates met with lawmakers on the Hill to create the change we all need.
The most important source of information about the threats posed by these chemicals comes from the industry itself. We've seen it on DuPont and 3M letterhead. We know that these chemicals cause cancer because they knew.
We visited key cities across the globe while mobilizing community members, activists, and lawmakers to lift up the stories of those directly affected by forever chemicals.
We are Dark Waters.
Launching the Why We Fight series.
I fight for my family.
I fight for justice and accountability.
My mother was pregnant while she directly worked with the chemical.
I fight for life.
They're calling on state lawmakers to address public health concerns and hold polluters accountable.
The taxpayers shouldn't be the ones paying for these costs.
It should be the chemical manufacturers, and we need to keep driving for action.
Dark Waters shares this story about one community in Parkersburg, West Virginia, but it's really telling the story of something that's happening all across the world.
In Europe, we presented to the European Parliament.
More and more evidence is put there that these group of chemicals can have serious health effects.
Unbelievable that we have allowed it to go to this extent.
We didn't, they did.
Indeed.
In the UK, we convened with members of Parliament to encourage stronger regulations.
If I look at us in Europe, I do think we can do a lot better. We really hope you learn more about this issue and how it affects your life and your health.
It's in the packaging, it's in our textiles, it's in our carpets, it's in what we wear, it's in our cosmetics. It's that far.
These new political commitments impact over 500 million people in the EU and could help set global standards on PFAS. And most recently, the EU Commission on Chemicals announced a total phase-out and ban on PFAS in Europe. When COVID hit, we mobilized and went virtual. And our work became even more important.
We really have to address this PFAS contamination. It decreases the effectiveness of vaccinating, especially in our children.
The kids, this is what it's all about right now. What are we leaving them?
This is a battle that is in everyone's backyard.
For veterans, it's time to fight.
And this is the action that we are encouraging everyone to take.
Every one of us can stand up, speak out, and make a difference.
So thank you. Thank you for taking action. Thank you for making your voice heard. And thank you to our partners who are still fighting to create a better world for all of us. To learn more and join the movement, visit fightforeverchemicals.com.
So as you can see there, a lot has happened and there is a lot of activism. One of the audience questions is, before we move into our second themed discussion today, is what activism for you has had the biggest impact on governance, so legally, corporate perspective, but also in terms of the social engagement on the issue? Does anyone feel perhaps louder, or maybe Rob, you've got a specific community at mind here where you feel that their activism supported your work in this arena? Go, Rob.
Sorry, get off mute. Yeah, just the community in West Virginia, being able to come together, giving blood samples from 69,000 people and providing medical information and insisting, we want to know the answer. We want the true science to come out for everyone, not just for our community, but for the world. And to see that story come out through the film, Dark Waters, was just an incredible impact. And, that the clip you just gave there of the consequences and the follow-up from the rollout of the film and the ability to reach so many people is just incredibly moving. And communities all across the country, we saw Emily Donovan down in North Carolina, who's been doing great work, and all over the world. I met with folks in the Veneto region in Italy a couple of years ago, dealing with these same issues. So to have these discussions, to have the ability to bring these stories out is so incredibly important for people to see how it impacts them, every one of us.
Indeed. And I think, as you said so well, Rob, from West Virginia to Veneto, and now we need this activism to continue, because now we're really talking at every single level of society, from business to law to the future US administration. For you must be an incredible feeling after all the work that you have done to date. And I think it brings us greatly into the next level of our discussion is, how far are we going? Where does our ambition seems to rise, and why not, right? There was a high ambition alliance led by Uruguay and Sweden, the ministers of environment, who kind of suggested a kind of global, binding kind of Paris Agreement type on chemicals. Dr. Bloom, I was wondering if you could come in and tell us a bit more about the High Ambition Alliance, and what was its purpose, and how does it sit with the future of our current panorama we're facing with PFAS legislation and PFOA legislation?
Well, unfortunately, the High Ambition Alliance was not supported by our government, the United States, by Japan, and really was strongly opposed by the chemical industry. So it has been weakened to where it's a voluntary agreement. And it's not clear that it's going to go anywhere. I mean, I think I feel like passing this on in two directions, because I know Rob has a really interesting idea. I've heard from him on something international that I think is really important. And then I know Anne-Sophie, I believe correctly, has said that business can do this. And, the chemical industry is really different from the manufacturing and retail industries. And we have found in the past, another example, but toxic flame retardants were used in a lot of products, furniture, children's products. And when the manufacturers learned they were toxic, when they learned the science, they joined the scientists and the advocates. And that separated out the chemical industry. They were the only ones opposed to removing the toxics. And at that point, that enabled government to take action. So I believe that, the work Anne-Sophie is doing with companies, when they really are educated and they learn what's in their products, they can side with the activists. And that's a very powerful voice. But I think Rob has such a cool idea. I just wanted to make sure that your idea comes up, Rob. So maybe I'll pass it on to you.
I love it when someone just gives me the road to the next speaker. Rob, please.
Sure. You have to keep in mind the types of chemicals we're talking about with PFAS, for example. These are completely man-made chemicals, do not exist on the planet, other than for the fact that there were a certain number of companies that made them and chose to release them out into the world, knowing they would get into our blood, knowing they would get into the soil, water, and stay there and not be able to break down. And once the information started to come out about one of them, PFOA and related PFOS, we saw actions taken in the United States to phase them out voluntarily, to take steps to stop making more of them in the United States over a 10-year period of time. The problem is these chemicals don't know national boundaries. They don't abide by geographic lines in the sand. These chemicals can travel the world, and they do. So even though the manufacture of PFOA and PFOS may have stopped in the US, PFOA or related chemical manufacture then starts up overseas in China or someplace else. And these chemicals have the ability to get up into the air, form with water droplets, and go across the entire globe. So dealing with these, in individual country by country basis isn't going to be very effective. We've got to find a way to deal with this on an international basis in a way that addresses the fact that these chemicals move globally. They move worldwide. And we need to be able to address it in a much more global, international way. One that makes sure that the companies that are actually responsible for releasing these, the manufacturers, the ones Arlene was talking about, the initial step in that chain, the ones that had the knowledge and yet put them out there, are fully responsible on a global basis for this. And so that communities, government entities all over the planet now that are struggling with figuring out how to monitor and how to pay to even do the sampling and the monitoring and the reporting and the science studies, they shouldn't have to be paying those costs. The companies that put them out and made billions and billions of dollars for decades should be paying for those on a global scale.
So that's very interesting, Rob. So you're kind of bringing out an idea of a kind of chemicals tax, I suppose. Am I right in framing it that way?
That there are folks that have talked about it in that sense as well. Yes, that you could almost do an assessment on a global scale for something that moves globally and is the profit is generated on a global basis as well. And it has global implications. It doesn't stop on geographic boundaries.
Very interesting. I think the concept in of these chemicals don't have boundaries, and also relating back to Dr. Bloom's comment for Anne-Sophie, if chemicals have no boundaries and a globalized world we're in where business operates, transcends borders, and we don't perhaps, from what I understand, perhaps a kind of high ambition alliance or a Paris agreement specifically on toxics is not the way for business. What do you think the perspective of business is, and how can you tackle this issue if it's not for a specific standardized framework? If I give that to you, Anne-Sophie.
Yes, sorry. Well, I think generally, actually, to me, the business community need to take a stand. They say, no, we are not going for PFAS, and really communicate that to the chemical producers, and then alternatives become more and more. But that's always only voluntary. That's not that powerful as legal binding acts. So to me, really what I see right now, what could reduce the global use of PFAS is really the upcoming European restriction that could be in place 2025. And the interesting there is it would be a broad restriction, more 4,700 chemicals, something like that. And all uses apart from essential use. This has never ever happened before in Europe, nowhere else. That big company, that so many chemicals, so many uses. So it's great. But what's the problem? That's of course, what is essential uses? Yeah. Some actors were saying then the shampoos again are essential use, or the furniture at home, my bed, or your clothes or boots and so on. And to me, that's not at all essential use. So this is something we jointly need to make forces, all of us, NGOs, academia, and companies, to show what is essential use really. Because this is a fight that will happen 2021 in European Union. The European Commission will decide what is essential uses. And I mean, this impact, why we have global impact, is because of this. We are 500 million people in European Union. There's a market of 500 people persons. And if you want to have access to this market as a company, you would have to fulfill the restriction of PFAS. So therefore it's so important. And when we talk around political wise, we quite agree actually that many political actors, NGOs, and companies want to see strict enforcement generally in Europe. So these will be enforced and make sure that all input will follow that as well. And the most companies we talk to, they want the same standard. They don't want different standard from different parts of the world, and they take the strictest one. So if we can really manage now to show what is essential use and what is not at all essential use, this could have a great global impact, in addition to your great idea, Rob.
I think it's really interesting to talk about essentials and how the understanding of that, and then where does that sit into this global transcending example that Rob gave? Where's the responsibility and accountability, and can we move that into an economic model, which, sometimes restrictions with competition models can be even more powerful. So it's quite interesting to bring those two perspectives together. But Dr. Neera, to bring another dimension in, I'll say, okay, so if we are looking at a high ambition alliance or a kind of Paris agreement, or if we're looking to reinforce the EU restriction in a way that will show it as a kind of case study moving forward, what about the intersection of climate and health here? Does the Paris agreement maybe need an addendum? Do we need to put chemicals into the Paris Agreement? And should we not be looking at, as Rob says, these elements are particles in the air, they're in our blood. climate transcends borders, climate pollution, issues we're facing as a community. It's the same concept. Are we not reinventing the wheel? Maybe we just need an addendum. I'll leave you with that idea, Dr. Nera.
A very interesting one. Just another idea as well. We are now in the middle, or at least that we need to do something about the COVID-19 recovery. And this is an opportunity for people to understand that to recover from what's happened, we need to understand how we reached this point. And one of the reasons why we reached this point is because we were destroying our relationship with the ecosystems, with the environment, with the biodiversity, and with our environment in general. We are polluting everything we touch. So in that sense, we did, I don't know whether you have the opportunity to see it, what we call it a manifesto for a healthy and green recovery, where in WHO we put 6 prescriptions telling the countries, particularly now that they are investing very much on the so-called stimulus packages and recovery packages, making sure that that investment will not go in the wrong direction, making sure that we will not make the same mistakes. For instance, let me give you an example. We are saying that we need to recover and to protect our health, but we are still giving subsidies to fossil fuels, for instance. Why not under the number 1 on recovering our relationship with the environment, not polluting, zero pollution, or the One Health concept that we are trying to promote, maybe including as well a more sustainable production and including there the issue of chemicals production, looking at what Anne-Sophie was saying. What is essential? What do we need? Why do we want to produce chemicals that will stay there forever? Do we really need it? But maybe the consumers will need. The Paris Agreement, what we are doing from the health perspective is that we are trying to incorporate, and I think we manage, the issue of air pollution. It was just the climate change, but we say, well, in fact, the causes are very common. It's the combustion of fossil fuels. So why not, using the health argument, having an addendum for all misuse of chemicals, or the consumption, or even the demand for certain chemicals that maybe are not essential. Very interesting idea.
Well, I'm excited that our reflection might be implemented. We could have launched a new idea for global recognition of removing PFAS and PFOAs through a Paris Agreement addendum. Let's hope we see this at the next meeting and that we've inspired some ideas. On the basis of ideas and action, I'd like to just ask every one of you right now, before we come to a close, to say, okay, if it's not about a binding international agreement, but thinking about PFOAs as a class, what is your recommendation as an action item to move forward on getting this recognized as a class, as a threat to us as citizens, and to make sure that it's phased out entirely as a class, and that we're not, as Rob said, doing 20 years per PFAS. Now, I'm not very good at math, but if we're doing 20 times 100,000, that is a heck of a long time. And I don't think we want to be doing that. So I'd ask everyone right now, and I'll just do it by order on my screen, actually. So I've got Anne-Sophie first. If you could tell me what your top recommendation would be for viewers today.
To work on what is essential uses. Yeah? If we narrow it down really to just be essential uses, then we can get rid of so much of the PFAS that are used in the world. Thanks.
Thank you. And Dr. Nera.
I think it's very, if we focus on the end users, I think they need to be better informed and more advocacy on the end users, the ones that are demanding, is critical. They are the ones who will influence then the action taken.
Thank you. And Dr. Bloom?
Well, I'll put in a word for transparency. We need to know what's in our products. The consumers need to demand that. Governments need to require that. And when there is PFAS in products, I think people really need more education, both government and business. I think government and business working together is very powerful.
Thank you. And Rob?
All great points. I like to throw out sort of a big picture item here. Recognizing we have a right to clean blood. You know, I think there's this people have always talked about the right to clean air, the right to clean water. And I think, with this story, particularly with PFAS, highlights that we should have a basic fundamental right to clean blood. We shouldn't have things that are being put in there against our knowledge, against our will, that will stay there, that are not natural, that are man-made. We shouldn't be allowed to be used as chemical waste dumps. So just a basic recognition of that concept.
Very powerful. And Laura?
Difficult to speak after all this speech. So I would say that we have to make people more responsible, and for two reasons: responsible for their choices, for the products they're buying, and responsible to be on at the side of policymakers in order to write down new policies in the future, but to be responsible of writing with them. We cannot go every time and try to knock at the door of the different policymakers. They need to sit with us, and we need to find out the way together.
Thank you. So, it's what we've got here, as we've said, we need to know what essential uses are, and we need to get clarity on that. We need to focus on citizens as users. We need transparency and education between governments and business, and relationships between governments and business. And then I'll pick on what Laura said before I go to the last words that Rob, we need to be more responsible in two areas. We need to have the knowledge to be responsible consumers, and we need policymakers to be responsible for better policy making, hand in hand with citizens, which I think is a very strong point. But I'll end with Think Film says maybe an addendum to the Paris Agreement. And as Rob said, we all have the right to clean blood, and we are not chemical waste dumps. I'm going to leave us with all that. I think it's really strong to say it's been a great honor to have all of you here today. I think we cannot leave without thanking Rob, the incredible man that's been fighting this journey for so many years, Mark Ruffalo, who worked with you to get this film out, Todd Haynes, an incredible director and artistic vision to make this film possible, Participant Media, who have done an incredible job and not just releasing a powerful film, but really showing that together through impact and film, we can change lives and make a difference. So it's a big thank you to everyone, and a round of applause. Thank you so much. Let's hope we continue to take this journey further and, transcend countries and borders. Maybe a last word from you, Rob, for the viewers before we leave.
Yes, thank you to everybody. And, now it's time to, I guess, take this discussion and conversation home and push it forward with everybody, and keep talking about it. And, that's the whole concept here of standing up, speak out, and one person can make a huge difference.
Yes, thanks, Rob. And everyone who joined today, you'll get the link to the film, and you'll have 48 hours to watch this incredible story. So thank you so much. And if you want to know more, you know who to connect with. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank
bye.
you.
Thank you.